Okay, very good. There we go, recording. Wonderful, thank you very much. Okay, good. Let's get started. I will present my presentation. So then you may not see me again until the end, but take a screenshot while you still got me, and we can continue as we are. So let me. Here we are. This is our topic for today. Okay, can everybody see this? Culture and COVID, why the US got its COVID response so wrong, and why China got it right. And this is being co-sponsored by Tuku Abdul Rahman University, thank you very much, and myself with Brill Solutions. Just to give a very brief introduction as to who I am, and my business is Brill Solutions. Brill stands for Better Results Through Intercultural Learning, and I've been an intercultural specialist, trainer, coach since 1998 or so. I used to work for the TSM Business School, part of the University of Twente in the Netherlands. I've studied culture with both with the university as well as the Royal Tropical Institute in Amsterdam, and also the Intercultural Readiness Check Institute in also in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. So I'm certified as an intercultural readiness check trainer. In addition, my current activities are teaching online. I do quite a bit of coaching in helping executives around the world be more effective in international business situations. Most of my emphasis these days is on the language, on speaking English, communicating more effectively in intercultural situations. And I help these executives around the world with not only being able to express themselves more readily, but also to be more effective eventually. So that's what I do, helping them to develop intercultural business skills, but going around the sideway, as it were, in learning English better. So it's all about doing international business. It's a very brief bio of myself, graduating at the University of Twente. Was born and raised in Los Angeles area in California, but since 1984 have been on the road primarily in Europe, 30 years between the Germany and the Netherlands, and have been in Asia for the past 4 years or so. First living in Kuala Lumpur, working with Dr. Tay, and then now I live in Siem Reap, Cambodia, where I'm a deputy director of an academy for Cambodian children, international, as well as working for an organization called Champion Coders, which is an Australian institute that teaches children to code. And we have an office in Phnom Penh here in Cambodia, and are now opening an office in Siem Reap, as I said, where I live. So that's me. The topic today, culture and COVID, and I must say I've gotten some pushback from Americans primarily because of this this title. Americans apparently are very defensive, especially in comparison to performance in China. And what I want to be clear about is this webinar today will be looking exclusively at the topic of cultural differences between China and the US and how that has manifested itself in the COVID response. Now, this is, it's not, even though we will look partly at politics, mostly as it relates to culture, this is not a political presentation. So I won't go into which political system is better than the other, quote unquote, which one respects human rights more, quote unquote, and other talking about freedom of expression, etc., only as it relates to cultural differences, and cultural differences showing freedom of expression, for example, as a manifestation thereof. So that's my, my disclaimer, because some of the pushback I've gotten has been rather, I don't want to say aggressive, but rather strong in relation to China and mostly diplomatic relations and so on. Okay, now that's clear. If there are any questions in the meantime, by the way, I assume that Tay, you will be able to handle any questions in the chat. So yeah, I see that there are people responding. Very good, very nice. And everybody can see the presentation. Wonderful. Good, let's get started. Today we will look at culture and the COVID response. Number one, and this is where the bulk of our attention will be today, what is culture? We will then look at the Hofstede dimensions of culture. We will look at a few critical incidences. So these are short case studies where you will be able to apply your interpretation of what cultural dimensions might apply. Then we will look at China versus US cultural dimensions. And last but not least, the COVID response as it relates to cultural dimensions, China versus the US. Now, as a sort of a problem statement to get started, let's first look at the statistics of how the COVID-19 pandemic has played out in terms of numbers. And then, oops, sorry. We look at three different areas: world, China, US. World population is 7.6 billion people. The number of COVID deaths, and this is as of yesterday, according to Worldometers, 2,405,388. China has 18% of the global total population at 1.4 billion, and number of COVID deaths, 4,636. 0.0019 of the global total. US has a population of 330 million, 4% of the global total, and COVID deaths at 496,063, 20% roughly of the global total, more than 2 times the next highest country, Brazil. Now, one of the pushbacks I got was regarding the numbers. Can we really trust the numbers coming out of China? And I can understand the skepticism, but there are a number of reasons why I think that these statistics are more or less accurate as they can be at any rate. And the skepticism that I heard also here in Cambodia applies to China. Cambodia is a mini China as far as that goes in many respects. I shouldn't go into too much detail on it about it online, but I trust these numbers. These numbers are more or less accurate, and partly based on the reactions of my clients. I have a good many clients in Russia. A few, many from, I'm sorry, Russia also, but China. Big cities, Beijing, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Shanghai, but also some out in the provinces. And the reactions I've been getting from all of my clients are pretty much match the situation that you read about in the press. Similarly, my clients in the US also. Very much reflecting what the official numbers say, as well as Russia, Europe, and throughout Asia, including Southeast Asia. At any rate, that's our current status as of today. Now let's get into, these are the facts. Now let's get into the what is culture, and how culture has resulted in these numbers. And I don't say that lightly, resulted in these numbers, because there is a very direct correlation in how the respective cultures have managed the pandemic and the respective pandemic in their countries, and what the statistics at the other end have resulted in. I do not doubt that one bit. So what is culture? Culture is the, quote, collective programming of the mind which distinguishes the member of one group or category of people from another. Programming of the mind. And this is a definition from Professor Gert Hofstede. May he rest in peace. He passed away just a couple of months ago. He was, 93, I believe. Quite a long career. In a book called Cultures and Organizations, the Software of the Mind. Now, Hofstede is a Dutchman and is not the only one who has done work on culture, intercultural relations. There are a number of other theories regarding culture. One is Edward T. Hall, who identified two key polarities, low context versus high context, monochronic versus polychronic. Richard Lewis is another who talked about grand polarity, linear active versus multi-active. Fons Trompenaars, also a Dutchman, and he very much business-related look at culture, analyzed responses to ethical questions, and lastly, Gert Hofstede identified dimensions of national values. Professor Hofstede first began his career in culture as an employee of IBM, in which he was tasked to analyze differences of IBM employees around the world and how they relate to various self-defined cultural dimensions, which we will define in just a moment. Now, some people argued early in Professor Hofstede's career that, well, this is a measurement of IBM employees and not an accurate picture of the culture as a whole. But pretty much by and large, we can that criticism has been dispelled. So this is very well documented, continuously updated, and we can see that updating not only in the constantly fluctuating numbers, and the numbers relate to cultural dimensions, which I will show you, but also updating in terms of adding new dimensions. So he's now up to 6 total dimensions, which we'll look at. And also, he has, there's been a constant updating, not from him, of course, now that he's passed away, but through his institute, the Hofstede Institute. And which points to, this updating points to the fact that culture is dynamic. Culture is always changing. We will talk about what influences culture, how you measure it, how you see it, how you don't see it. And one thing to remember is that culture changes. So we look at an iceberg. This is a very common image. If you ever take a culture class, you will always see the iceberg because it's a perfect metaphor for culture itself. What you see on the surface, what defines a culture for most of us, is what we see and what we hear. We hear language, we see text writing, we see how people dress, how people behave, the foods they eat, the customs they have, the practices they have. But then underneath the water, where you don't see very clearly, are the norms, the attitudes, judgments, and the deeper you go in the water, the more murky it becomes. Understandings, assumptions, beliefs, and ultimately core values. And arguably, most of the attention goes to what you can see. Makes sense, because people, what's most immediate gets the most attention. But really what the most influence has regarding cultural relations and interaction is what's under the water, what you don't see. And in working with companies and culture, and how these companies, in terms of organizational culture, as well as national culture, as well as professional culture, show most of the problems come from what's underneath the water, what's unseen. So most of the challenges when dealing with different cultures come from the assumptions, the beliefs, the core values. The number one assumption that creates the most problems is everyone is just like us. If I'm thinking this way, if I see the world in my way with my cultural glasses, everybody else must also. That's just quote unquote normal. What you will learn once you start studying culture and once you start experiencing culture around the world, what you will learn is that there is no normal. Or if there is, it's the very base normals, if you look at the Maslow needs, for example. But if you're talking about assumptions, how we interact with each other, what we think when we're doing business with each other, then normal is very much flexible and depending on context. And the case studies that we're going to be doing in a little bit, the critical incidences, will show that very clearly, that context is everything. Good. What's important with to understand with culture is that even though within the very large parameters of culture, there are individual differences. Okay, and unfortunately, one of the reactions that you get as a cultural specialist when you talk to people is, oh, well, I know so-and-so, he's from country X, and he doesn't act that way at all. So how do you say that these cultural values, so-called, these cultural dimensions are accurate? My experience is otherwise. Or I've been to country Y, and they don't act like that. How can you say that that's true about that culture? And that's the problem, is that many people base their perceptions of culture not only on what their personal experiences are, which may be very anecdotal, but also based, for example, on media portrayals of that culture in their country, different practices that reinforce stereotypes. And stereotypes are very, very dangerous because stereotypes, by necessity, are an oversimplified image or idea of a particular type or person or thing. And what's fascinating is you see that in general, the less a person has contact with the culture, the stronger the stereotype is of that culture. So you could say, for example, that all Americans are shallow, fast talkers who only want to make a deal with you, or that all Americans are friendly with you one day and slap you on the back and call you by your first name, but the next day they have no idea who you are. I'm only saying these stereotypes because I'm an American. I can get away with it. But there, of course, are many, many different stereotypes. For you Malaysians, for example, there are many stereotypes regarding the different ethnicities within your own country, between the native Malay, Chinese Malay, and the Indian Malay. Some of these I've observed myself living there for 2 years in KL, and some have been also portrayed in the media quite strongly. At any rate, the trouble with stereotypes is that they lead to a cultural bias. And like I said, that you start to react that all people of this one culture act in this one way. And what happens often is that this starts to form an implicit stereotype. So you start to subconsciously think this way about all people from that particular culture. Now, I said before that culture can also have other dimensions: national culture, organizational culture, professional culture. But this statement here regarding stereotypes and cognitive bias also applies to gender, for example. All women are ... That's, for example, why you see very few, in many societies, very few women in STEM courses: science, technology. What is STEM? Science, technology, something mathematics. Okay, I'll look it up. But yeah, so there's these cognitive biases exist outside also of national culture, but for today's purposes, we'll only look at national culture. So they create subconscious bias. They create also in-group favoritism. What this means is that you have a preference for people in your own environment from your own culture. In a way, you can say this is, quote, natural, that we are more comfortable with people who are just like us. When people are not like us, we become uncomfortable because it's unpredictable. In a way, this is biological. You know, as animals, we have a natural instinct to distrust what is unfamiliar for us. Fortunately, as advanced beings with a higher level of consciousness, reason, and rationality, we can approach that differently and say, okay, even though my gut might tell me that this is an unfamiliar situation, maybe I can subdue that and reach out, interact, get to know this other person, so that these fears that I have, these innate biological fears, can be tamped down. At any rate, in-group favoritism means that you favor the people within your own group, people just like us. The third point, danger of stereotypes, is that it also creates an out-group homogeneity. As I mentioned, all Chinese are ... all Americans are ... all Indians are ... that you tend to look at a particular national culture, people from a national culture, and automatically paint them with one brush, as the Dutch say. You automatically assume that they're all alike, that they will all act in the same way. As I said, within a general cultural environment, there will be individuals. So it's not on fact, but based on a picture of who this person might be based on their outward appearances. This is also unfortunately reinforced not only by influences in the media, where you see certain national types that all act the same way for purposes of selling a product or promoting a show or some other media product. But also it tends to reinforce that stereotype. And that's also dangerous, because reinforcing the stereotype is very easy, very simple, and as I said, it robs the individual of his or her potential for value. Good. Having said that about stereotypes, I was walking through the train station in Utrecht in the Netherlands, rushing towards a train, and I saw something that caught my eye. So I went back and took a picture because it unfortunately reinforced the stereotype, but I could not resist. And that picture is this. And what you see here, you see that there are Dutch people. How can you tell they're Dutch? Well, one is extraordinarily tall. And yes, the Dutch are this tall. If you've ever been to the Netherlands, you might see that the average height seems to be around 2 meters tall. So what's striking about this situation that caught my eye was not only the differences in height between the young Asian woman standing behind the tall Dutch man, but also the differences horizontally between the different shoppers. You've got the couple in the front who are at the cash register. You've got the unusually large man, and you've got the woman in the blue jacket. They are all spaced as Dutch people space when they line up. And this is, to be clear, this is pre-COVID. So this is a few years ago. Now that's approximately 2 meters, well, maybe 1.5 meters distance. So those are COVID approved distances from each other. But this is pre-COVID, and this is the natural way that people line up in the Netherlands. And Asia, I'm not sure what Asian country she might be from. I wouldn't hesitate to guess. Perhaps China. You line up much closer to each other. If you were to line up the Dutch way in Asia, what would happen? You would never get to the front because people would continuously stand in front of you, thinking that you're not there to buy a product, but just taking time. So yeah, this showed very clearly a cultural difference. Unfortunately, in a way, it also reinforces the stereotype. But yeah, I couldn't resist. Good. Any questions up until now? This is rather a lengthy introduction into our topic and what we're going to be looking at. If there are no questions, and to be clear, again, if you've joined us recently, if you have a question, please type it in the chat box on the right. Good. Let me check my Facebook Live to see if there are any messages. No? Okay, we're good to go. All right. Now, I've mentioned it a couple of times already, but let's take a look at it. We're going to now look at the dimensions of Kurt Hofstede. So now we've looked at what is culture. We've looked at, we will now look at Hofstede's dimensions. Kurt Hofstede initially defined 4 cultural dimensions. He initially defined power distance, individualism, masculinity, and uncertainty avoidance. As I mentioned, culture is fluid, and the study of cultures has matured. Not to mention, Kurt Hofstede has also gotten many more resources to be able to do additional research. So in the meantime, he added a number of years ago long-term orientation, and then more recently, he's added indulgence. Now I have a description, full description of 5 of those dimensions. Indulgence, we have some information, but it's not as developed as the other 5. So we're going to look now at the different dimensions of culture, starting first with power distance. So a high level of power distance is, before I get started, we'll look at it in just a minute in comparison. But the way these different dimensions are measured are by a very thorough process of interviewing, of surveys, of personal contacts, of having cultural specialists within the country and also outside analyzing cultures. And this is also constantly updated and reinforced by by very thorough research methods. So when we talk about the characteristics of these, we're going to look at 5 of the 6 dimensions. When we talk about characteristics, this is based on scientific research. And then we will then look at how do we apply these dimensions in practical situations. So first is power distance, and a country, and I say country to equate that also with culture, even though that may not always be associated with each other. The high power distance countries are typified by a very strong centralization, very strong hierarchies, large gaps in compensation, authority, and respect. Low power distance countries are much flatter. There's less hierarchy, and supervisors and employees are considered almost as equal. And I have some tips there on the right, how if you're dealing with another national culture, how you might do better business with that culture. So all at once, I've given you both the theory and the practice, and how you can, if you recognize that you are in a country that has a high power distance, and I will show you how you can find that out. If you're in that country, this is what you should do. So just as a point of curiosity, each country in the world has been ranked. Let's see, where is it? Just a moment. Has been ranked as far as against each other as to different dimensions. So when we're looking at power distance, who wants to guess what the country in the world that has the lowest power distance? In other words, the country that is the flattest, where supervisors and employees are considered as equal. Does anybody want to venture a guess by typing something in the chat? Colin says the Netherlands. Okay. Anybody else want to guess which country has the lowest power distance? Okay, that's a very good guess, Colin, and from both anecdotal experience and also from the research, I would guess that as well. And the Netherlands is number 15 on the list. The lowest, surprisingly, is Austria. Oh, there we go. Thank you, Devana. Devana's done her research. Very nice. United States, I would guess that, Manyao, also because of some companies, especially in Silicon Valley, you might see that the way they behave with very open office spaces, with a boss that is very much of the people being on the work floor. This might be the case, but it's not. There are many, many countries that come before the United States. The United States is relatively high on the list at scores a power distance index of 40. So now the lowest country with a power distance index of 13 is Israel. I'm sorry, Austria. You were right, Devon. Austria at 11, Israel at 13, Denmark, New Zealand, and Ireland for the lowest 5 on the list regarding power distance. All right, now you see it coming. Who is the highest on the list? Which country has the highest power distance ranking? In other words, in which country is the boss? Nobody argues with the boss. It's the boss's decision, and he has a right to have compensation, authority, and respect because he's the boss. Very strong hierarchies. Okay, Stephen. Dr. Tay, you're cheating. Yes, sir. That is absolutely correct. Malaysia. And Devana, also, well done. Malaysia is the highest when it comes to power distance. Its scores off the charts, literally, at 104, according to the latest research of Hofstede. But the next 4 countries, if we just take the top 5, are interesting because they're quite varied. But when you look closely at these countries, especially in terms of political structure, you see very clearly a manifestation of power distance. The next 4 countries after Malaysia are Guatemala, Panama, Philippines, and Mexico. So Malaysia, if how would you say, the shorthand would be the strong man theory of politics, and yeah, you see it very strongly in those countries. What's interesting is one of my clients is in Latvia, and just a moment, let me look. Latvia scores on the list. Oh, it's not. So let's pick a Baltic states. Lithuania, also not on the list. Estonia, also on the list. Just from experience, Latvia scores probably down around where Austria and Israel do. Very, very flat, very much no hierarchy. The boss is the boss, but it's very open for feedback and open to doing things a different way. And it's a IT company where everybody works remote. And I'm working with the boss, working with the CEO of this IT company. And they just hired a key person from Mexico. And it's fascinating working with the CEO because she is just going crazy that she can't, she keeps asking her Mexican employee for feedback and suggestions on how to do things better. Her reasoning, the Latvian being, she's the specialist, she should know. But I know exactly what the Mexican employee is thinking. Mexican employee is thinking, you're the boss, you should know. Why are you asking me? Just tell me what to do and I'll do it. If you don't know, Miss Boss, then who does? So that very much that strong hierarchy sometimes is a barrier to, for example, innovation, creativity, because if the boss doesn't work with their employees in an open and listening way, it could stifle some of those more creative influences. But the less I say about how high power distance countries, the better, considering the majority of you are Malaysian. But I'm sure you recognize this. I'm sure that you see that indeed in Malaysia, compared to, for example, Singapore, just right over the border, and how different Singaporeans are regarding hierarchy. That's a very strong cultural difference. Good. Let's move on. If there are no questions, okay. The next dimension is individualism. And individualism with regards to culture, high individual societies place a high valuation on people's time and their need for freedom, enjoyment of challenges, expectation of rewards for hard work, respect for privacy, and then low individualism, in other words, collectivism. So we have individualism, collectivism, an emphasis on building skills and becoming masters of something. So being very, very focused on building own, even though you would think if they're building skills, aren't they investing in themselves? Yes, but they're investing in themselves so that they can contribute to society. And that's what's most important. Harmony is important. Giving the health of society as a whole is very important. So that's why a country, for example, with low individualism, you see very much almost a swarm instinct, if you think about the flocks of birds, that everybody acts in concert for the good of everyone. High individualist countries do not. They value personal and individual freedom. Okay, any guesses who the lowest on the list is for individualism? The lowest on the list regarding individualism. So these are people, okay, Japan, it's a good guess. Taiwan, okay, also a good guess. Taiwan is down there, but it's not all the way down there. What's interesting is often you see these, many of these cultural dimensions acting in concert with each other. So for example, a country that is high in individualism would be low in power distance, because why should the boss tell me what to do? I'm my own person. Conversely, a country that is high in power distance, in other words, the boss is the one with the answer, and low in individualism, would be low in individualism. So they wait for the boss to tell them what to do. So often these two dimensions work in concert with each other. Okay, Costa Rica, Switzerland. Okay, oh, interesting. This is low individualism, because Switzerland would rank rather high actually on the list. The lowest individualism, Guatemala, and then again Ecuador, Panama, Venezuela, Colombia, so Indonesia, Pakistan. So you see again that a strong power distance also correlates to a low individualism. Taiwan is number 11 as far as I'm sorry, number 10 from the bottom. Now, that's low individualism. Who would be high individualism? Any guesses? The highest? Okay, Devona says UK, Norway, Pei Chong. Pei Chong wins. The United States. Yeah, Augustine, very good. The US, indeed, we're number one. Yeah, indeed. The highest in the world for individualism at 91. Underneath that are the, as you said, Dr. Tay, the Anglo-Saxon countries, Australia, UK, Netherlands being number 4. So Netherlands very high in individualism. But then you're saying, hey, wait a minute, wasn't the Netherlands rather low in power distance? I'm sorry, also a bit high in power distance. You would, Netherlands is roughly in the third from the bottom, so in power distance, but high in individualism. There are some contrary scores on these charts that will be explained as you look at all the different dimensions. So USA is the highest in terms of individualism. Now, if you're looking at a company or at an organization or a country, and you want, but especially if you're looking at organizations, the two dimensions that make the most difference regarding how that organization is structured, how they get results, how they communicate, are the first two that we're looking at, power distance and individualism. So how does the boss act? How do individual employees, do they take the initiative or do they wait for the boss to act? And often you see that organizational cultures have different cultural dimensions, also corresponding to the industry that you're in. So for example, a manufacturing company would be, for example, very high in power distance and low in individualism, because it's not done if somebody decides to take a longer break when they're working on the assembly line, or if they suddenly want to take the afternoon off, or even worse, and this is a story that was in Bloomberg last week, was looking at Apple and how Tim Cook has really made the right decisions for Apple to become the behemoth that it currently is, $2.3 trillion market cap, and how manufacturing in China is the only way that they can produce effectively because of low individualism, high power distance. The people there do what they're told. That is part of the culture. That is part of the way they do things there. And there was one case in particular in Austin, Texas. There was an experimental Apple manufacturing plant, just to see, can we do it in the U.S.? And they picked one of the big box. I think it was the Power Mac or something, because their reasoning was that if that Americans were not suited to be focusing on the very small devices, the iPhones and the iPods, then, and the very fine work. So you needed to give them something big and boxy in order to see if this experiment works. And they were getting products from this manufacturing plant in Texas, and somehow the circuit boards were crooked. They never came out right. They traced all the way back through the supply chain and found that a single employee in Texas was screwing the circuit boards manually. They weren't automated at that time. Screwing the circuit boards on, going from left to right, instead of using the approved method, which was in a star shape to make sure that the circuit board was straight on the computer. He was using his freedom of expression, his individual rights to screw that circuit board on the way he felt was good. And unfortunately, it resulted in a major loss in manufacturing, in overrun costs and time delays and so on. So it was quite a lesson for Apple. And Tim Cook realized that. Steve Jobs at the time also realized that. I'm sorry. This plant was set up shortly after Steve Jobs passed away. So Tim Cook finally discovered there's only one place not one place in the world. There are many places in the world, but certainly manufacturing cannot be done in the United States because of the culture just doesn't allow it. Good. Okay, moving on. So that's individualism. Any questions so far? People do what they are told equals China's success. Yeah, indeed. Which, Augustine, thank you, that will lead us into our case studies and also looking at COVID-19 and the Chinese reaction to it, and why America. You're already lifting up the screen to show why COVID has been such a disaster in the U.S. But okay, we'll get to that. Next, masculinity. Masculinity doesn't necessarily mean only that men are men and women are women. What it's talking about more is roles and roles in society. Yes, men are, quote, masculine. So there's a role of masculinity that men earn the money and women take care of the children. And also, if women do work, then it's a very specific kind of work. It's not working in oil fields and driving trucks. It's more secretarial work and so on. You know the picture. Low masculinity means a woman can do anything a man can. That they can get a job flying helicopters, as my first wife did, or also working in an oil field or what have you. But it's also reflected in how power is distributed, and that powerful and successful women are admired and respected. So you see very much that in low masculinity countries, that there are very many women in power. Maybe some of you have seen, they have pictures of it's one of the Baltic countries, has the entire cabinet, the prime minister, the minister of finance, transportation, you name it, are all young women. Not just women, but young women. You see, for example, Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand also. It's a very low masculinity country. Yeah, you see it very obvious in different aspects. What it also has to do with is not just roles, but also how people, how society is constructed and how people care for each other. In low masculinity countries, you see very much that there is this feeling of you've got to do for yourself, stand up for yourself, be very strong. There's much more a feeling of, hey, we're all in this together. we all need to care for each other. So a very strong societal bond. And that's what I was talking about in the Netherlands, is very high in individualism, very high, but it's number 4 on the list. But it is also very high in, or very low in masculinity. So it's a very highly feminine culture. There's a lot of collectivism. They care for each other very much. So does anybody want to guess what the lowest masculine country is? In other words, the country that is the cares for each other the most, has the highest incidence of social care, social programs. The government is here to help. We all care for each other. Oh, there we go, Divana, very good. High masculinity, Sweden, Norway. It's the other way around. Sweden is the lowest masculinity. So cares for each other very much. And yeah, Stephen, you're right. Nordic countries, the bottom 5 for masculinity, in other words, the most feminine cultures are Sweden, Norway, the Netherlands, Denmark, and wait for it, Costa Rica. How Costa Rica got in there is anybody's guess. So I'm not sure. It's good, Nirvana. Yeah. How anybody's guess that Costa Rica is there? It demands some research, because they are also very low in individualism, very, very low, and relatively low in power distance. So yeah, sometimes there are outliers that are explained by various factors. For example, and this is something that we didn't talk about much, how does culture come to be? How do these countries get to be the way they are? Why is Malaysia the highest in power distance, for example? Why is the US the highest in individualism? Why does Costa Rica have a relatively feminine culture? And many of these influences that change society and result in these different cultural differences are historical, political, for example, societal developments, geography. You might be surprised to realize. For example, when I compare, for example, the Netherlands and the US, the Netherlands being very feminine culture, and the US being very masculine, or not very masculine, but higher in masculinity at 62, versus the Netherlands, which is 14 in masculinity, has partly to do with history and geography. If you look at the Netherlands, there are no natural borders between themselves and their European neighbors on the west and on the east and south. No mountain ranges between them and Germany, or between them and Belgium, France. So to recognize who another Dutchman is, you have to be very closed with each other. There's the sea also on the other side, which means you have to work together to fight against the sea taking over your country. So collectivism, all working together. Sorry, not collectivism, but a strongly feminine culture, caring for each other. The United States, on the other hand, was founded by pioneers, people who set out to seek their fortune from the UK, from Europe, also eventually from Asia, a place where people took refuge and took chances, starting their own businesses and so on. You see that also in Australia as well. a very rugged country that was founded by convicts from the UK initially, but then also became a place where people went to seek their fortune, to become rich or whatever. So that meant a certain type of person went to these countries. Now, of course, we're not counting the Orang Asli, the native people who were there first to begin with. We're talking mostly about culture in the present day based on various influences going back hundreds, even thousands of years. In America also, what's the one thing that most people say when when you ask them, oh, you went to the US for the first time, how was it? Oh, people are so friendly there, you know? You get into an elevator and it's hi, how you doing? Or, you know, you pass them on the street and they nod and they say hi, very friendly. Well, consider that the first settlers, as it were Americans, cowboys, for example, setting out along the plain, heading west to seek their fortune. They had to know, is this person coming up, friend or foe? So you lift your hand, you wave, you say hello, you receive that back, and everything's fine. Then you can eventually work together. So yeah, these are how culture is designed, how culture is developed over hundreds of years. Good. That is masculinity. Two more, and then we need to move on. What time is it? We are at 10:11. Okay. In principle, we have 45 minutes. Any questions so far? No? Good. Next up, uncertainty avoidance. Now, this is a little bit difficult to understand, but when you understand it, you see that you see it manifest in many different cultural environments. High uncertainty avoidance means that, oh, sorry, what uncertainty avoidance means is that you have a way of expressing yourself that is uncertainty of the future. So it has to do with how society deals with a future that can never be known. So what happens in the future? We don't know. Are we comfortable with that, or are we threatened by that? And if we are threatened by that, how do we deal with it? What beliefs do we create? What structures do we create? What systems do we create? So you see in a high uncertainty avoidance culture, you have very much very formal business conduct with lots of rules and policies, very much structure. If there is a uncertainty, people react very nervously, for example, become very emotional, and tend to avoid differences, because if you are dealing with differences, then you are creating even more uncertainty. Low uncertainty avoidance means that you are more informal or relaxed, more concerned with long term than what's happening on a daily basis, and you're more accepting of change and risk. Let's do this real quick. Who would guess what the lowest country is regarding uncertainty avoidance? The lowest country for uncertainty avoidance. In other words, very informal, more concerned about the long term, very few structures regarding, very few rules in place, and also a very flexible attitude. Any guesses? USA, high uncertainty avoidance, Greece, very good. Okay, Devona, I get the feeling you're looking online, but that's okay. we all have our resources. Good. Low uncertainty avoidance, Ireland. Okay. High uncertainty avoidance, Japan. Okay, very good. Divona, you win. Singapore is the lowest uncertainty avoidance, followed by Jamaica, Denmark, Hong Kong, and Sweden. Ireland is just after that, is number 6. So yeah, Pai Yi, you did that. You got it right. Okay, and let's look quickly at high uncertainty avoidance. Just a moment. High uncertainty avoidance. Augustine says, how can Singapore be low uncertainty avoidance when they are kiasu? What is kiasu? I have no idea. Sorry. Can anybody type a translation for me? Afraid to lose. Oh, okay. Okay. Well, that would be a contradiction, perhaps. You could also perhaps explain that by looking at other cultural dimensions. And that's the thing about these dimensions, is sometimes you see what appears to be an exception, but yet is explained by a corresponding other dimension. And I mentioned, for example, the Netherlands, which is relatively high in individualism, but very low in masculinity. Yeah, that seems, and also very low in power distance. So it seems like a contradiction at first. You say, but once you look at all the different dimensions, and understand them in context, then you begin to see that, okay, it's not a contradiction after all. So I'm not a specialist in Singaporean culture, but yeah, and I'm not sure, also, be careful, Augustine, being afraid to lose, is that a national trait, or is it based on your experience of a few contacts? Or is it a cultural stereotype that might be left over from an earlier time, for example? Or maybe based on a particular historical event that has created that stereotype? There's lots of things to look at. So so Agustin says Chaoism is synonymous with Singaporeans. Okay, that's possible. It's perhaps something that we should look at. So yeah. I'm sure it's to be explained. Not in this webinar, but maybe in a future one. Good. Highest uncertainty avoidance. I believe somebody got it. Devona, you got it. Greece, indeed. Off the charts, 112. Followed by Portugal, Guatemala, Uruguay, and Belgium. Now the Dutch would have very many comments about the Belgians as far as that goes. Because strangely enough, well, the Netherlands is about middle of the list, 53 with uncertainty avoidance. You would think would be higher considering their geographic position, very much threatened by flooding. So global warming, meaning that the rivers flowing in from the east are threatening the east and the south of the country, and rising sea levels are threatening the west and the north of the country. Yeah, west and north of the country. So you would think that their uncertainty avoidance is higher, and it may start to rise, this dimension, based on challenges with climate change. So, okay, Augustine says high uncertainty avoidance with Japan. Japan is 92 on the list. Indeed, indeed. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, good. Let's move on. We have, in principle, 2 more. Let's do 1 more. Hang on. Okay, now we have long-term orientation. Long-term orientation, and you can already see how it's filling in, how long-term orientation leads directly to response to COVID. In long-term orientation, the family is the basis. And parents and men have more authority than young people or women, because parents and men are already in the future. They are respected, as age is very much respected. A strong work ethic and high value placed on education and training. Low long-term orientation means that there's very much a promotion on equality, high creativity, individualism, and the so-called golden rule, treating others as you would want to be treated, and then self-actualization. So you can already guess at opposite ends of the spectrum would be China and the US. Just a moment, let me look. I already gave it away, but yeah, I don't have all the countries with research for long-term orientation, but I do have the highest. Anybody guess who the highest long-term orientation country is? Long-term orientation, looking for the future, building for the future. This country famously makes decisions that influences 7 generations into the future. Any guesses? High long-term orientation. It's one of the 2 countries featured in today's webinar. You got it, China. China is off the charts in terms of long-term orientation at 118. And the lowest, the United States is not the lowest. The United States scores relatively low at 29, but the lower scoring countries are primarily in Africa: Ghana, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and so on, Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia. And you typically see that in warmer climates, that there is a less focus on the long-term future and more focus on what can be achieved today. So yeah, that's very much a long-term versus short-term orientation. Okay, very good. Let's move on. Our next dimension had to do with indulgence, and very briefly about indulgence. Indulgence has to do with how you have indulgent societies and you have restrained societies. And with indulgent societies, it has to do with how much gratification you are allowed. And no accident, restrained societies mean that you deny yourself rewards, entertainment, and so on. So leisure time and gratification of desires are very high in indulgent countries and very low in restrained societies. Now, I don't have it here in the presentation, but the score for China in terms of indulgence, would you guess this? Which society is more indulgent, China or the US? Anybody guess? Which is higher on the indulgence scale, China or the US? Okay, we need to move quickly on, so I will just go ahead and tell you. Versus China versus the US, China is definitely more restrained than the US. The US scores at 68 on the list. It's not the most indulgent society, but it's fairly high. And China is at 24, so very much in the bottom lower quadrant. Very much a restrained society. Now, as we talked about before, cultures are constantly in shift. They are constantly dynamic. So all of these dimensions may change over time. and become more or less on the scale. Good. Let's go with, just a moment, our next task is to look at case studies, critical incidences. So is everybody ready? We're going to look at let's look at the 6 different dimensions. So power distance, to review, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation, indulgence. Power distance, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation, indulgence. So, first critical incident. Pay attention, and what I'm going to ask you at the end of this is if you could name 2 cultural dimensions of the 6, so 2, pick 2, that play a role here in this critical incident. And number 2, answer the question: how should he run meetings in the future? So after I read this, pick 2 dimensions and then give some advice. How should he run his meetings? Good. Joel Williams is an engineer who was sent by his company to work in a subsidiary abroad. There he finds that meetings are very different from what he is used to. Meetings in his new country seem to be used as a way for the department head to issue instructions and to explain what is to happen, rather than as a place to brainstorm and gather ideas as a team, which is what he is used to. Then Joe is promoted to the head of the department. How should he run meetings in the future? So Joe comes from a country to a country and a company that does business differently than in his home country. In his home country, the department works as a team. They brainstorm together. They come up with ideas together. In this new country, they get together and the department head tells them what to do. So, which 2 dimensions would you say are at play here? And secondly, how should he run the meetings in the future? So these sorts of questions are great for in-class discussions, less so working online when everybody's muted and most people have their cameras off. So yeah, could somebody put a comment of some sort? Which 2 dimensions do you think might play here? All right, anybody? Okay, we can't wait. Oh, there we go. Oh, lots of, I'm sorry, I should have scrolled down. My bad. Okay, good. All right, we've got a few. Covering Lim says power distance and individualism. Augustine says power distance and uncertainty avoidance. Same with Stephen, good. Devona, power distance, good. Chi Chloe, sorry, says power distance, individualism. And Devona, you're saying also, what was your first one? Sorry, PDI and UAI. So power distance and uncertainty avoidance. Good, good, very good. Yeah, good guesses, or good analysis, I should say, not guess. Okay, and number 2, how do you think he should proceed? Well, first of all, I would very much agree that power distance plays a very strong role here. So so well done with I'm guessing power distance. The other one, it can be debated. Power distance, clearly. In the or the country that he's from, everybody mixes together, gives ideas, so the boss is no better than the others. In the new country, the boss is clearly in charge. What he says goes. The other dimensions, yeah, you can debate a little bit. So is it individualism? Is it uncertainty avoidance? I can imagine that uncertainty avoidance would be a strong one. That we're talking about rules, structure, making sure that everybody is clear about what's going to happen long in the next day or into the future. So maybe also combined with long-term orientation, perhaps. I can also see how individualism would play a role. That in the country that he comes from, individualism is very high. Everybody's got an idea. Everybody wants to make it heard. And then in the new country, it's somewhat less so. So, question, how should he proceed? What should he do? Now, we only have, I think, we only have a half an hour, and I haven't yet gotten to the meat of our presentation, and that's how, looking at COVID. So let's just jump into this. I've had many people say that Joe Williams should simply just do what I see, Augustine, thank you, adapt to the new culture. Good, good, good. Perhaps Joe needs company orientation. Yeah, indeed. So Joe needs to get with the program. Joe needs to understand that they do things differently there. And I've had clients before who have said Joe should do things his way. He should show that it's better doing things in the way he's used to. And yeah, adopt his style. Robin, he needs to keep his style to diversify. Okay. See, that's to diversify the company's culture. The problem is with that. Oh, hang on. Let me see what Stephen says. Power distance plays a huge role in this case, as the new place that Joe works tends to expect instructions in the meeting. Yes, power distance, good. Joe being the head of the department, I think he would pre-planned a detailed instruction or procedure for people to follow. Yeah. In other words, Joe should adapt to his new environment. The problem, Robin, that he keeps his style is that how is culture formed? How do cultures come about? Both country cultures as well as company cultures. Culture is not necessarily changed by one person. Cultures change very slowly over time with many influences. As I mentioned before, with countries, it's history, geography, different political events, for example. And one person coming into a different cultural environment, most likely what would happen is Joe would be ostracized. He would be shut out. He would be seen as the odd man out, as the strange one. And little by little, his authority as the boss would begin to decline. Remember when I said one of the attributes of a company where there is a high power distance, and if you as the boss go to an employee and say, you know, I was thinking of doing this today, what do you think of it? What's the person going to say? He's going to say, well, yes, of course, boss. Yes, of course. That's a great idea. I think you should do that. Even though the employee might be thinking to themselves, that's the worst idea I've ever heard in my life. He's not going to say it to the boss because the boss is the boss and the boss knows better. If the boss continues to say that, you know, what are your ideas? Let me hear some feedback. His authority will begin to weaken. He will be shut out of the company culture. No matter how many benefits you see to doing things differently if he comes in and tries to exert his culture on another environment? It's not going to work. Say you have a meeting and Joe comes in and says, we're going to brainstorm today. Okay, I'm going to write all your ideas up on the whiteboard. So let's go. Let's do it in a classic brainstorm fashion. We're going to have 5 minutes. Shout out your ideas, and I'll write them down. Okay, ready? Go. Okay, am I back? Can everybody hear me? Okay, sorry, I lost connection. I think I'm back. Okay, you can hear me. Good, good. Anyway, so I'm not sure where I lost connection. So he tries to get some feedback from the people in the meeting. Wants to write down everything on the whiteboard, and nobody responds. Everybody's looking at each other like, "Who's this guy?" Just not going to work. He might be able to introduce ideas slowly, building credibility as he goes. But if he comes in and tries to exert his own culture on top of the other one, it's just not going to work. So let me read your comment, Robin. Or Devona says, oh, I love your comment, Devona. Joe needs to do his cultural research on the respective country. Indeed, indeed. And Robin says, the world is changing very fast. So every country, every company needs to make the change happen to adapt to the changing environment. In theory, I agree with you 100%, Robin. The problem is that not everybody thinks like you and I do. As I said, people think differently. Many people in companies, why do they go to work? Especially in a country that has long-term orientation, high power distance, low individualism, high uncertainty avoidance. Are they going to want to go to work and think about new ways to do things? What they want from their work is safety, security, to know that everything's going to happen today the same way it happened yesterday and the same way it will happen tomorrow. They need that regular structure to feel safe, secure, and able to do their work. So not everybody can come in and think of creative ideas and be innovative and looking for new ways of doing things. Unfortunately, not everybody thinks in this creative way. Okay, good. All right, let's move quickly because we only have a little bit of time, and I'm losing a couple people, so we need to perhaps move quickly to the topic at hand. So, China versus US cultural dimensions. You see the website link at the bottom where I got this data, and this data is fairly up to date. You see it's a little bit different than some of the numbers I gave you earlier with the ranking. Yeah, as I said, these numbers are always changing. China versus the United States. So power distance in China, high. US, relatively low. The biggest difference, and as you will see, the biggest difference as far as, I'll show in just a minute, you see how this might make a difference in terms of response to COVID. So individualism in China, 20, very low, very, very low. United States, highest that there is, really. Masculinity, almost the same. So in terms of society caring for each other. And that's, you often see the role of government. It's quite under debate in the US currently. For example, self-proclaimed socialist Bernie Sanders made a lot of headway in the leading up to the elections last year. But ultimately, people chose for safety, security, and a more trusting the government. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Uncertainty avoidance, U.S. slightly higher than China. Long-term orientation, absolutely no surprise that China scores so highly. And then in indulgence, the U.S. also, no surprise, the U.S. very high. So now we will look at the COVID response, U.S. versus China. Now, how do these cultural differences manifest themselves in the COVID response? So remember what our statement is. Our statement is why the US got its COVID response so wrong and why China got it right. So now you see this very clear here. You see the power distance. In other words, respect for authority means that when it's time for, when the government says to do something, people do it. Respect for authority combined with low individualism means that if the government says, this is the plan, this is what we're going to do, everybody wear masks, everybody keep a 2-meter distance from each other, and everybody in quarantine from starting at 5 o'clock tomorrow, then that's exactly what happens. There are no naysayers. There are no people who resist. So if we look at power distance in the US, there is not so much respect for authority. If more telling is individualism, and in the US, very much individuals in the US think liberty and justice for all, that I'm an individual, that there is, even though there is an explicit emphasis on equal rights in American society, unfortunately, at least in the case of COVID, individualism has led to the anti-masker movement. And these are people who have, quote, done their research to find out that masks don't work, end quote. And I read somebody who said that when somebody tells me that they've done their research, what this means to me is all they've done is they've looked online to find somebody who agrees with them. And you see that very often with the anti-masker movement. So yeah, Robin, you said it very well. Chinese people think individual sacrifice can benefit the whole society. That hits the nail on the head. That sacrificing your individual opinions and individual desires is secondary to society as a whole. So you see that in the low individualism and high long-term orientation also, because they are building for the future. If I sacrifice pleasure today, also low indulgence, if I sacrifice pleasure today so that my children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren can have a more beneficial future, then that's what I'm going to do. Americans, unfortunately, with their high individualism and low power distance, are the opposite of that. They think, I'm living for today. Why should I care what happens in the future? And unfortunately, that has also led to some very unfortunate developments regarding the COVID, that people mistake individual freedom for a lack of responsibility for those around them. So individual freedom is fine as long as it only influences yourself. When it has to do with influencing other people around you, that's a different story. And there's a classic case of the Supreme Court making a decision regarding yelling fire in a crowded theater, that some people might argue that that is freedom of expression, that I can yell fire if I want. The problem is that you are endangering the lives of other people by doing so. And I'm not going to get into the issue of Donald Trump and his impeachment trial, but that was one of the arguments that his defense was using, was that it was freedom of expression was the reason that he could go ahead and say whatever he wanted regarding attacking the Capitol. But anyway, the prosecution argued that bringing other people in danger is where the freedom of expression stops. So, yeah, it's very clear that seeing these cultural differences, you can almost have predicted when the pandemic first started that the numbers that we saw in the beginning would have played out this way, especially considering the lack of government leadership in the beginning. Now it's starting to change because there are competent people back in the administration and in Washington, and people who know how to deliver a message competently and confidently, and have implemented policies and made decisions that very much are focused on turning the pandemic around and executing competently the vaccine programs. So the COVID is now in decline in the US, in no small part because of the change in administration. So some of these cultural dimensions can be mitigated depending on the circumstances. As I said in the beginning, context is everything. And the context in which you are making these decisions has everything to do with how the ultimate results take place. So, answering the question or looking at the issue, why China did everything right? Because as you said, Robin, well said, that in China, they believe that the individual is secondary to the long-term health of society. So when the government says to wear a mask, they wear a mask. The government says to keep social distance, they keep social distance. Individualism comes second. I've had friends in the US say, well, aren't there anti-maskers in China? Aren't there people who say, you know, a mask is tyranny, it's I'm not going to wear it because it's against my individual rights? I said, well, if they are, they're most likely in prison because the state does not tolerate these sorts of individual freedoms. And I've had other people argue with me also about the premise of today's webinar, saying that, well, you think that's right, what China's doing. So I didn't say that in general. What I meant was that the reaction to the COVID is very much, especially when you look at the results, is very much in the favor of China because of the way society is, the way the Chinese people act, and the way Chinese people respond to authority. So that's more or less our presentation. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Leo. Is it end of the lecture?
Yes, sir.
So we would like to invite participants on the floor to have a question. We only have 7 minutes more. So please ask a question. This lecture was recorded down. I trying to put this, I trying to retrieve this message and then this video, and then I will put it into most probably in YouTube later on. Okay. So any more questions? So if there's no question on behalf of the university, I'd like to appreciate the most sincere thank you to Mr. Leo Salazar, always supported me in this particular subject. Thank you. Leo Salazar. You may leave the classroom.
Okay.
Student may leave the classroom, or all of you may leave the classroom. I will still stay for a while.
Okay, very good. Good.
And
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate the interaction. I know how difficult it is. You guys are sitting behind computer. Well, I am too, day and night. So yeah, having new information is it's been welcome. Thank you very much for your participation, like I said, and thank you, Tay, for the invitation. It's very much a pleasure to be part of today's webinar. So see you.
yeah.
Bye-bye.